Imagine Earth sitting in the cosmic waiting room, humming quietly to itself, doing absolutely nothing flashy for billions of years. Oceans gently slosh, continents shuffle around like someone rearranging furniture without commitment. And life, if you can even call it life, is basically a microscopic whisper in the background. It is the sort of world where if you tuned into the planet's broadcast, you would probably assume the channel was broken. And then, somewhere around 540 million years ago, Earth abruptly reaches over, clears its metaphorical throat, and slams the evolutionary unmute button so hard that biological history still feels the vibrations. The Cambrian Explosion begins, and suddenly the planet stops being a quiet rock with microbial doodles and transforms into the wildest talent show the cosmos has ever hosted. Good evening, curious minds. I truly hope you will enjoy today's video. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where and when you're tuning in. And if you find yourself learning something new as you drift towards sleep, consider subscribing, but only if you enjoy these calm journeys through the universe. Now, let's begin. Before this moment, listeners would have described Earth the way you describe a very slow elevator. It exists, it moves a little, and not much else happens. The ocean floor would have looked like the world's least exciting party, just slimy carpets of simple life forms, no decorations, no snacks, no drama. But the Cambrian period arrives with all the subtlety of a confetti cannon, and life responds by inventing more new forms in a few tens of millions of years than it had created in the previous several billion. That is the biological equivalent of someone sleeping through an entire semester, then writing the greatest final exam the universe has ever seen in one afternoon. Scientists still argue about what exactly pulled the evolutionary fire alarm. Some say Earth's chemistry shifted in just the right way. Others point to changes in climate or the oceans. And some researchers suggest that life simply hit a developmental milestone, like a toddler suddenly realizing it can open the kitchen cabinets. Whatever the trigger was, the outcome is clear. The pace of innovation skyrocketed until the planet brimmed with creatures so bizarre that if you described them today, people would assume you were making up characters for a science fiction cartoon. And the best part? These creatures were real. They swam, crawled, hunted, hid, bumped into things, probably made questionable life decisions, and filled the oceans with experimental designs, as if evolution were speed-running creativity mode. This explosion of complexity might sound normal to us now, because we live in a world overflowing with biological variety. But picture it from Earth's point of view. For billions of years, life barely changed. Entire geological eras passed with nothing more dramatic than the invention of slightly better slime. Then suddenly, bodies appeared. Actual bodies with structure, appendages, mouths, and sometimes an alarming number of spikes. Arms races began. Ecosystems formed, predators lurked, prey fled, and the oceans became arenas where nature repeatedly said, "What if we try this?" Imagine watching that unfold in real time. It would feel like binge-watching evolution after someone turned on fast forward. This chapter exists to drop you directly into that moment of cosmic absurdity. The instant the planet woke up like it had been shaken from a long nap and suddenly declared, "All right, let's get weird." Because weird it got. The Cambrian Explosion wasn't just a burst of new species. It was a reimagining of what life could be. Skeletons appeared, muscles diversified, organ systems became intricate. Creatures started reacting to each other instead of simply enduring the environment, and the environment responded right back. Life was discovering strategy. It was discovering style. It was discovering that being alive gave you options, and those options could evolve into entirely new possibilities. From a storytelling perspective, this moment is irresistible. It is rare to find a chapter in planetary history that feels like a dramatic plot twist written by a screenwriter who was tired of slow pacing. One geological second, Earth was a snoozing blue orb. The next, it was hosting a biological rave where everyone showed up wearing experimental costumes and absolutely no one understood the rules. If Earth had a camera crew, this is where the episode would cut to chaotic underwater footage accompanied by dramatic music and a narrator saying something like, "Everything was about to change." And in a very real sense, everything did. The Cambrian Explosion is not just a quirky moment when life went creatively wild. It is the foundation of the complex world we live in today. Every animal that walks, swims, crawls, or sneezes traces its roots back to this burst of innovation. We look at it now with scientific tools and evolutionary theories, but underneath all the analysis, there remains this sense of astonishment, a recognition that something extraordinary happened long before humans ever arrived to wonder about it. It was the moment Earth decided to stop whispering and start shouting, a biological turning point that still echoes in every creature alive today. This chapter serves as our doorway into that ancient spectacle. We stand at the threshold, listening as the universe cracks its knuckles and prepares to tell a story 500 million years in the making. A story of sudden invention, dramatic transformation, and a planet that, for reasons still mysterious, woke up one day and said, "Life, let's make things interesting." Long before the Cambrian world erupted into its evolutionary carnival, Earth moved through an age so quiet, so uneventful, and so politely uneventful that calling it calm feels like an understatement. If the Cambrian Explosion was the moment nature kicked open the door and shouted, "Surprise!" then the pre-Cambrian era was the long hushed pause beforehand, the cosmic equivalent of an empty stage, dim lights, and one audience member gently coughing. Life existed, yes, but it clung to simplicity with the determination of someone refusing to upgrade their ancient phone because it still works fine. For billions of years, Earth was home to microscopic organisms that drifted, divided, and repeated those two hobbies with remarkable dedication. Imagine the earliest seas not as bustling ecosystems, but as quiet, sprawling galleries of single-celled pioneers. These tiny entities floated like specks suspended in a dream, each one little more than a bag of chemistry trying its best. There were no predators lurking, no jaws snapping, no creatures zipping around, just a planet-wide calm so uniform that even time itself seemed to yawn. The most dramatic action might have been a microbe deciding to split into two copies of itself, which, in fairness, was basically the hottest trend for several billion years. Life had discovered reproduction, and apparently that alone kept the schedule full. But this stillness was not boredom, not really. Beneath the surface of that quiet evolutionary plateau, Earth was slowly tuning the instruments needed for later innovation. Chemical cycles evolved, the oceans learned how to hold and mix nutrients, and the atmosphere shifted in ways that rewrote the planet's chemistry. Slowly, very slowly, conditions formed layers of potential that hung in the background like a conductor raising their baton before the first note. None of the early organisms were aware of this brewing potential, of course. They simply drifted, absorbed sunlight, and maintained the microscopic equivalent of a group chat where only two participants ever sent messages, and both said something like, "Still here." What makes the pre-Cambrian world particularly fascinating is how stubbornly it held on to its simplicity. Despite experiments with slightly larger cells or microscopic communities forming mats on the ocean floor, complexity refused to escalate. If evolution were a storyteller, this era was its long introduction, necessary, foundational, and quietly constructing every detail needed for the later plot twist. The oceans became laboratories for chemical stability. Energy sources diversified. Early organisms refined the art of turning sunlight, chemicals, or heat into sustenance. In a sense, life was gathering tools without yet learning how to build. One of the most striking features of this era was how patient everything seemed. The earliest forms of photosynthesis emerged long before animals ever dreamed of existing. These early innovators did not know it, but they were reshaping the planet in ways that would allow all later life to flourish. The oxygen they released trickled into the atmosphere at a pace that made glaciers look speedy. Over millions of years, oxygen slowly accumulated, reacting with minerals, sinking into the seas, and changing the planet's surface. At first, oxygen was nothing more than a strange chemical byproduct, an accidental side effect of microbial survival, but in time, it became one of the most important ingredients for complexity. Slow transformation, invisible progress, and deep patience defined this long era. During this pre-Cambrian calm, Earth itself went through enormous changes. Continents drifted, collided, and separated like slow dancers trying to remember the choreography. Volcanoes built mountains and erased them again. Ice ages came and went, sculpting the world's surface with the leisurely pace of a glacier dragging a paintbrush. These geological transformations created countless new environments, each offering slightly different conditions for life to explore. Even if life remained microscopic, the stage beneath it was changing dramatically. It was as though Earth was rearranging the set long before the actors arrived. Beautifully, almost poetically, the quiet of the pre-Cambrian was not empty. It was preparation. It was the universe quietly tightening bolts, oiling gears, and stacking ingredients in a kitchen that had not yet begun cooking. If you looked at a drop of ancient seawater under a hypothetical time-traveling microscope, you might see only a scattering of simple cells. But what you would not see, and what is easy for modern minds to overlook, is the immense depth of chemical fine-tuning happening inside those tiny forms. Membranes became more robust. Metabolic pathways found efficiencies. Communities of microbes worked together in ways that foreshadowed cooperation and competition. Even without animals, ecosystems were beginning to take shape. And yet, for all this subtle progress, the world remained quiet. No fins slicing through water, no shells clattering, no creatures burrowing or fleeing or inventing the first accidental collision. That absence of action is exactly what makes the later explosions so dramatic. The Precambrian era is the long breath before a shout, the still horizon before a storm, the peaceful dawn before every bird on Earth decides to hold a concert at once. Nothing about it suggests that Earth is about to unleash an evolutionary fireworks show. If anything, it suggests the opposite, that this quiet world might continue drifting indefinitely. But beneath that stillness, potential gathered like pressure under ice. And when the transition finally came, when life stepped out of its microscopic solitude and began experimenting with bodies, movement, and interaction, the shockwaves would forever reshape the planet. This chapter sits at the edge of that transformation, gazing back at an age of serenity so complete that no creature within it could have imagined what was coming. The pre-Cambrian calm was not thrilling, but it was essential. A deep silence that made the coming explosion feel all the more extraordinary. Long before the Cambrian seas filled with creatures that looked like nature's first attempts at surreal art, Earth was busy rehearsing behind the curtains. If the Cambrian explosion was the grand premiere, then the planet spent millions upon millions of years adjusting lights, tuning instruments, and rearranging props in ways that would transform a quiet world into the perfect runway for evolutionary experimentation. These environmental triggers did not arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, like Earth raising an eyebrow, then another, and finally deciding to get serious about hosting the most ambitious biological show in history. One of the most crucial backstage crew members was oxygen, not the lively, breathable gas we take for granted today, but a slowly increasing presence that had spent eons being absorbed by rocks, seas, and anything chemically needy enough to snatch it up. For ages, oxygen was like an aspiring performer who kept showing up to auditions, only to find the stage occupied by minerals with better timing. But eventually, the planet reached a point where sinks were full, reactions slowed, and oxygen could finally float freely in the atmosphere and dissolve into the oceans. It did not burst in like a dramatic character. It seeped into the world with the steady confidence of someone rearranging furniture while everyone else is asleep. As oxygen levels climbed, the chemistry of the seas began to change. Suddenly, metabolic strategies that once struggled to get by discovered they could run faster, burn brighter, and support more complex energy demands. Oxygen made it possible for organisms to generate greater biological fuel, setting the stage for creatures that could do more than simply drift. Without ever intending to, the planet was upgrading life's entire energy infrastructure. It was like handing a population of tiny organisms a power bank, and discovering they had, hidden inside their genetic toolkits, the capacity to build stronger, faster, and more dynamic bodies if given the chance. But oxygen was only one part of Earth's backstage renovation. The climate, too, was undergoing major adjustments. The planet experienced long cycles of cooling and warming, including icy periods that wrapped Earth in vast sheets of frozen silence. These intense freezes may have scrubbed the environment clean in ways that allowed new geological and chemical patterns to emerge. When the ice retreated, nutrient-rich runoff flowed into the oceans, delivering minerals that acted like vitamins for a biosphere ready to expand its menu of possibilities. Imagine Earth as a chef tinkering with recipes, discovering that a pinch more of this and a dash less of that could lead to a radically different flavor of life. Temperature shifts also created gradients in the oceans, zones with distinct chemical identities. Some regions brimmed with nutrients, others hovered in leaner conditions. These differences encouraged organisms to adapt, and adaptation is evolution's favorite hobby. Places where cold, nutrient-loaded waters upwelled to the surface may have acted like training grounds, pushing early organisms to experiment with new ways to survive. The oceans were not chaotic yet, but they were no longer monotonous. Variety began shaping opportunity, nudging life toward paths it had never walked before because, until now, those paths did not exist. Volcanic activity added its own flair to the backstage preparations. When volcanoes erupted, they spewed gases and minerals into the atmosphere and oceans, altering chemistry and depositing materials that later contributed to fertility in marine environments. Though destructive in the moment, these eruptions played long-term roles in enriching habitats. They were Earth's messy but necessary stagehands, knocking things over, throwing ash into the sky, and unintentionally setting up conditions that benefited life far down the timeline. Tectonic movements also played a subtle but powerful role. Continents shifted, breaking apart and drifting into new configurations that changed ocean currents, coastlines, and the distribution of shallow seas. These newly formed coastal environments, bathed in sunlight and stocked with nutrients, acted as biological incubators. They were the warm, shallow pools where evolution could experiment with enthusiasm. The deeper oceans had their own character, but it was in these coastal regions where many of the early innovations later associated with the Cambrian world found fertile ground. Even the chemistry of ocean water itself was evolving. Levels of dissolved ions shifted, creating new possibilities for building more rigid materials like early shells. Certain minerals became more available, offering a palette of construction materials that organisms had never accessed before. Think of it as nature providing a bigger hardware store. Suddenly, life had more than basic tools. It had options, metals, minerals, and structural possibilities that would eventually support the rise of complex bodies. All these environmental changes interacted with one another in ways that created a perfect storm of opportunity. Rising oxygen allowed for greater energy use. Climatic cycles reshaped habitats. Nutrient flows created hotspots of biological innovation. Geological transformations expanded the diversity of environments. And through it all, life responded not with immediate fireworks, but with quiet preparation, fine-tuning internal processes, exploring small advantages, and building a foundation that would soon support an eruption of creativity the planet had never seen before. By the time the Cambrian period arrived, Earth had completed a backstage overhaul so thorough that the oceans were ready for an evolutionary performance unlike anything in previous eras. The lighting was right, the chemistry was balanced, the temperature gradients were interesting, and the nutrient cycles were humming along like well-rehearsed machinery. The stage was not just set. It was primed, polished, and practically begging for innovation. And when life finally stepped forward to claim that stage, bursting into new shapes, new abilities, and new behaviors, it did so because Earth had quietly spent millions of years preparing the perfect conditions. The Cambrian Explosion was dramatic, but its roots lay in these long, steady environmental adjustments, each one contributing a vital piece to the planet's most ambitious biological production. When life finally stepped onto the newly prepared Cambrian stage, it did something unexpected, something bold, clever, and a little bit dramatic. It started building armor. Not emotional armor, though that would have been handy too, but literal body parts that were tougher than anything the world had seen before. Hard structures began appearing across the oceans, and evolution seemed to say, "All right, everyone, enough of the soft body lifestyle. Let us try not getting squished for a change." This shift was more than a new fashion trend. It was one of the most transformative innovations in the history of life, and once it began, it snowballed into an evolutionary avalanche. For billions of years prior, organisms were essentially delicate sacs of biology. They were squishy, flexible, and entirely at the mercy of whatever bumped into them. If the pre-Cambrian seas had been a dance floor, every creature would have been the kind of dancer who gets accidentally elbowed and immediately goes flying. But the Cambrian oceans introduced a new rule. Structural integrity mattered. Bodies were no longer just blobs navigating currents. They became frameworks, machines, and architectures with purpose. The appearance of harder tissues was not simply an upgrade, it was an open invitation for evolution to expand its creativity, like handing an artist a set of new materials after millennia of drawing with a single crayon. These rigid structures began modestly. Early biomineralization involved external coatings, or tiny plates embedded within tissues, more like sprinkled gravel than full suits of armor. But even these early attempts at toughness offered advantages. A creature with a handful of mineralized elements was harder to puncture, slightly heavier, and perhaps even more capable of pushing against the seafloor or resisting water pressure. What began as tiny reinforcements soon became shells, spikes, and exoskeletons. With each incremental change, new opportunities emerged. Hard parts allowed organisms to anchor muscles more effectively, enabling stronger motion. They provided leverage, stability, and shape. Even simple protective shells gave certain species the confidence to explore environments that had once been too risky. But evolution rarely stops at good enough. Once hard body parts appeared, the advantages cascaded. The moment creatures could protect themselves more effectively, predators were encouraged to innovate. A hunter that had previously relied on soft prey suddenly faced opponents wearing the ancient equivalent of bike helmets. This was the spark that pushed evolution to tinker with gripping limbs, sharper structures, and more forceful feeding strategies. With every improvement in defense, offensive adaptations followed, and vice versa. The arms race had begun, and it fueled a rapid proliferation of designs. One of the most remarkable outcomes of these new hard body parts was how they altered the physical dynamics of life. Soft-bodied creatures tend to move with gentle wave-like motions, drifting and bending through water. But introduce rigid segments, articulated joints, or protective shells, and suddenly movement becomes varied, powerful, even purposeful. Some organisms learn to burrow into sediments using strengthened mouthparts or claw-like structures. Others crawled or scuttled along the seafloor, leveraging new rigid anchors for locomotion. A few developed enough structural sophistication to propel themselves quickly, perfect for escaping predators or chasing prey. Hard parts did not just protect bodies, they reshaped the choreography of early animal life. These innovations also allowed greater size. Without sturdy frameworks, large bodies collapse under their own weight, both in water and on land. But with shells and exoskeletons, organisms could scale up. They could grow broader, taller, thicker, and more robust. Larger forms brought new ecological roles. They could stir sediments more effectively, casting small ecological ripples that changed the chemistry of local environments. They could compete differently for space, occupy new territories, and push other species to adapt or relocate. Size, combined with structure, amplified the complexity of ecosystems in ways soft-bodied life never could have achieved alone. Of course, building a hard body part is not free. Organisms needed access to minerals, calcium, silica, phosphate, and new metabolic pathways to extract and deposit them. That meant retooling internal processes, inventing new cellular strategies, and taking evolutionary risks. But the creatures that succeeded unlocked levels of stability and protection that dramatically boosted survival. Over generations, natural selection rewarded these architectures, spreading biomineralization across diverse groups. It became one of the great success stories of early animal evolution. As the oceans filled with these armored pioneers, diversity exploded. No two species seemed content with the same design. Some favored smooth shells like polished stones. Others experimented with bumps, ridges, and geometric patterns that looked like early works of biological sculpture. A few went all in, creating structures so elaborate they seemed to serve decorative purposes as much as practical ones, though evolution never adds ornament without reason. Every ridge, every flange, every spike had a role in resisting pressure, deflecting attacks, or anchoring newly powerful muscles. Cambrian seas became crowded with these inventions, each species tweaking the idea of hardness in its own way. This snowball of innovation reshaped not only bodies, but relationships. Once organisms could defend themselves effectively, they could also invest in exploration, specialization, and competition. New species expanded into niches that had remained untouched for ages. The seafloor, once a landscape of soft mats and simple forms, became a busy realm full of armored wanderers leaving trails, pits, and disturbances that reshaped habitats. Hard parts made creatures not just independent, but influential. They left marks, literally, in the form of burrows and tracks that recorded their presence and forever changed how life interacted with its surroundings. And so, a single evolutionary leap cascaded into a monumental shift. What began as nature's polite suggestion to stop getting squished evolved into shells, armor, joints, claws, and an entire reimagining of animal architecture. The emergence of hard body parts was not the climax of the Cambrian Explosion, but it was one of its most defining engines, propelling life into new directions and unlocking possibilities that the soft-bodied world could never have supported. This chapter marks the moment when evolution stopped tiptoeing and started building with confidence, constructing bodies that could push back, stand firm, and carve out new futures. Hardness became the new frontier, and life embraced it with enthusiasm, creativity, and a flair for structural drama that would echo through every age to come. If the Cambrian oceans had a single moment where everything collectively panicked, it was the moment eyes appeared. Vision did not tiptoe into the world. It arrived like someone flipping a giant underwater light switch and exposing everyone who thought they were alone at the snack table. For the first time in Earth's long and mostly blind history, creatures could look around and actually see things: food, rivals, hiding places, and, most inconveniently, predators. Until this moment, life relied on senses that were more like educated guesses: chemical hints, pressure nudges, temperature shifts. But vision changed the entire script. It turned the oceans into arenas where awareness mattered, where decisions could be made in split seconds, and where creatures had to upgrade their survival strategies because the world suddenly had definition. To appreciate how shocking this transformation must have been, imagine living in a world where everything is sensed through vague gradients. Shapes do not exist. Distance is a rumor. Danger is felt only when it is close enough to ruin your day. Then, one generation, a creature evolves a light-sensitive patch. Just a tiny one, barely useful, but enough to notice the difference between brightness and darkness. Perhaps it helped it avoid swimming into the equivalent of underwater furniture. Perhaps it helped find sunlight for energy. Whatever the reason, this small advantage held enormous potential. Natural selection seized that potential and began refining it, gradually transforming simple photoreceptors into curved surfaces, focusing abilities, and eventually early versions of eyes that could detect movement with surprising clarity. Once creatures could detect movement, the rules of the ocean changed dramatically. Soft flickers in the water now meant something. A disturbance in the light was no longer random. It could indicate dinner or doom. This was the evolutionary moment where camouflage became more than a happy accident. Patterns mattered, colors mattered, behaviors mattered. For millions of years, life had existed in a dim haze, like trying to navigate a forest at night with nothing but vague moonlight. But now, the sun might as well have risen underwater. Vision did not evolve uniformly. Different species developed it at different speeds and in different styles. Some created wide, shield-like eyes that gave them panoramic awareness. Others crafted compound eyes, mosaics of repeating units that turned the world into a shimmering tapestry of motion detection. These eyes may not have produced crisp images like a modern eagle's, but they were astonishing upgrades compared to blindness. Even blurry vision is immensely useful when the alternative is sensing your environment through chemical whispers. One of the most fascinating consequences of vision's rise is how it increased the tempo of life. Before eyes, reactions unfolded slowly. A creature might detect a chemical trail and leisurely investigate, hoping it led to something edible. But sight compressed time. If a predator darted into view, the potential prey did not have the luxury of contemplation. It reacted instantly. This probably led to the first frantic underwater chases in Earth's history, as if the oceans transformed from a sleepy, drifting ground into an action sequence. Creatures that had once meandered now needed speed. They needed agility. Some developed streamlined bodies. Others learned to burrow quickly or hug the sea floor with newfound urgency. Eyes also encouraged innovation in communication. Recognizing members of your own species became easier when you could actually see them. Visual cues could evolve. Body gestures, flicks of appendages, changes in posture. These signals may not have been sophisticated at first, but they opened up new behavioral pathways that blind organisms never needed. Vision supported the rise of group dynamics, territoriality, and even strategies involving distraction or deception. A creature that could be seen could also send messages, intentionally or otherwise. Perhaps the most profound impact of sensory evolution was on thinking itself. Not human-level cognition, of course, but the earliest forms of rapid decision-making. With information streaming in faster and with more detail than ever before, nervous systems had to evolve in tandem. Processing visual signals required more neurons, more coordination, and faster responses. This may have been one of the drivers behind increasingly sophisticated neural architectures. With better brains came more complex behaviors, and with more complex behaviors came more opportunities for species to branch into new ecological roles. Alongside eyes, other sensory systems blossomed. Structures that detected vibration grew more refined, allowing creatures to sense distant disturbances. Chemical receptors diversified, enabling finer discrimination between types of food or threats. Touch became more valuable as appendages grew and movement patterns changed. The Cambrian oceans did not just become visible, they became perceptible in layers: light, motion, pressure, taste. Sensory evolution worked like giving life a tool belt, where previously it had only a single screwdriver. It is impossible to overstate how transformative this sensory revolution was. Before vision, the oceans were peaceful not because creatures were kind, but because they literally could not tell what anyone else was doing unless they bumped into them. After vision, peace became a luxury few could afford. Awareness fueled competition, competition fueled innovation, and innovation fueled diversity. Predators grew sharper and faster. Prey grew trickier and more elusive. Species expanded into new territories simply because they could now navigate them with greater detail. This chapter marks the moment when the ancient seas stopped being quiet blue murk and became alive with motion, intention, and interaction. Eyes were not just tools, they were catalysts, stretching open a world that had existed all along, but had never been fully perceived. With the lights effectively turned on, every organism had to adapt or perish. The Cambrian Explosion gained velocity, drama, and intensity, all because creatures began to see one another, and in doing so, discovered a world far more complicated than they had ever imagined. Long before graceful fish sliced through the oceans with elegance, the first creatures to attempt genuine movement looked more like animated punctuation marks than athletes. Mobility in the early Cambrian was chaotic, experimental, and often unintentionally comedic. Picture tiny beings attempting to swim with bodies that had never tried anything more ambitious than drifting. Some zipped forward like excited noodles with questionable steering. Others wiggled with such enthusiastic confusion that their motion looked less like purposeful travel and more like underwater panic. But underneath the awkwardness lay an evolutionary breakthrough of staggering importance. Movement was becoming a deliberate act, not an incidental side effect of currents. And once life realized it could move itself rather than be moved, the oceans transformed into an endless arena of possibilities. The earliest swimmers did not begin with elegant fins or streamlined silhouettes. They started small, with rippling bodies and contracting muscles that created waves along their sides. These pioneering motions were clumsy, but they allowed creatures to break free from passive drifting. The moment an organism could change direction, even if only slightly, it gained control over its destiny. It could approach food rather than wait for food to bump into it. It could leave stressful environments. It could try to avoid predators, or if having a particularly bold afternoon, pursue something edible. This shift from being passengers to pilots marked a turning point for evolution. The mechanical innovations behind early movement were just as remarkable as the behaviors they allowed. Muscles became more organized, arranged in patterns that allowed bending, twisting, and contracting with reliable timing. Soft tissues developed structural divisions, effectively creating rudimentary segments. These segments allowed different parts of the body to move independently or in coordinated waves. It was as though nature discovered the joy of hinges and immediately began attaching them everywhere. Segmentation unlocked the ability to push against water with more force and more directionality, turning wiggling into propulsion. As movement technologies diversified, so did body plans. Some species elongated until they resembled living ribbons capable of undulating through water with surprising speed. Others flattened their bodies to glide just above the sea floor, skimming along like prehistoric hovercrafts. A few created paddle-like appendages that beat rhythmically, granting them bursts of motion that resembled flapping. Each new structural experiment introduced a different style of locomotion, and evolution seemed eager to test every possibility. The Cambrian oceans started to look like a biological fashion runway, where creatures competed not with colors or patterns, but with innovative designs in motion. These new body plans were not limited to swimming. Crawling emerged as an equally important breakthrough. Some animals developed flexible undersides or tiny appendages that allowed them to grip surfaces and move across the sea floor. This newfound ability to crawl opened access to regions that swimmers could not exploit. Cracks, burrows, and patches of sediment that held valuable nutrients. Once crawling gained traction, digging followed. A creature that could plow into soft sediment gained security, shelter, and access to buried resources. Digging also reshaped the environment itself, churning sediments and mixing layers in ways that transformed local ecosystems. Movement did not merely change how creatures behaved. It changed the literal geography of the sea floor. With mobility came specialization. Some organisms evolved bodies optimized for speed, reducing drag and refining their musculature until they could dart with startling precision. Speed allowed them to outmaneuver slower species, leading to early forms of pursuit and escape. Others leaned into agility rather than raw velocity, developing shapes that allowed tight turns or sudden directional changes. A creature that could pivot quickly had a substantial advantage, especially in a world filled with predators experimenting with new strategies. There were also species that adopted a life of slow, methodical crawling or gliding. These creatures often compensated for their lack of speed with sturdier bodies or better awareness of their surroundings. A slow crawler might be covered in reinforced plates, relying on mobility only when absolutely necessary. Others used mobility primarily for feeding, sweeping their appendages across the sea floor like tiny rakes gathering particles. One fascinating side effect of these mobility innovations was the emergence of distinct ecological layers. Creatures began occupying zones based not only on food availability, but on their style of movement. Fast swimmers filled open waters, weaving through currents in search of prey or escape routes. Crawlers dominated the seafloor, forming bustling neighborhoods of armored wanderers. Burrowers carved out subterranean tunnels, hidden from view but constantly reshaping the sediment from below. The ocean became vertically structured, with different modes of mobility defining different lifestyles. Mobility also elevated interactions between species. Creatures could now approach, avoid, chase, flee, court, or compete in ways impossible in previous eras. With movement came encounters, and with encounters came new evolutionary pressures. A species that moved efficiently had an edge. A species that moved poorly faced immediate disadvantages. natural selection began sculpting bodies with a new level of precision, rewarding anatomical innovations that balanced speed, stability, strength, and control. The most captivating aspect of this mobility revolution was how rapidly it diversified. Once the door opened, evolution tried dozens of locomotion strategies simultaneously. Some succeeded spectacularly. Others vanished quickly, leaving behind fossils that look like nature's discarded prototypes. But even failed experiments mattered, because each one expanded the boundaries of what life could attempt. The Cambrian seas became a living workshop filled with prototypes, revisions, and bold new designs, each movement style contributing to the growing complexity of early ecosystems. By the end of this chapter in evolutionary history, the oceans were no longer passive arenas. They were dynamic landscapes where motion defined survival, where species carved their own paths, and where the ability to move was just as important as the ability to eat or reproduce. Mobility turned life from a drifting existence into an active pursuit, igniting behaviors and strategies that would echo through every era that followed. The Cambrian Explosion was not just about new forms. It was about new ways of navigating the world, each more inventive than the last, transforming early seas into a swirling, bustling spectacle of living motion. The instant mobility, awareness, and structural upgrades swept through the Cambrian seas. The oceans experienced something they had never known before: strategy. Suddenly, life was not just existing, it was interacting in complicated, competitive, and occasionally dramatic ways. If earlier eras were quiet libraries of drifting creatures, the Cambrian became a bustling marketplace where every species urgently negotiated its place, usually while trying not to get eaten. Predators and prey emerged with unprecedented clarity, and evolution, ever the opportunist, saw its chance to orchestrate the first grand arms race in the history of animals. No referees, no timeouts, and absolutely no rule book. Before this era, predator was a word that would have made no sense to any creature alive. Eating was mostly a passive affair. Organisms absorbed nutrients, filtered particles, or engulfed small nearby cells in the microscopic equivalent of slow-motion hugs. But once eyes, mobility, and hard body parts arrived on the evolutionary stage, a new kind of relationship formed, one based on pursuit and avoidance. Creatures began recognizing opportunities to feed on others as those others tried desperately not to become lunch. The ocean may have been quiet before, but it was suddenly filled with the underwater version of startled gasps, frantic escapes, and confident lunges. Predators dawned with features that now seem intuitive: streamlined shapes, grasping appendages, and mouth parts capable of piercing or slicing. Each innovation was a revelation to the early seas. Imagine the first creature that figured out it could use its new appendages not just for crawling, but for grabbing something squishier and less fortunate. That realization must have felt equivalent to discovering a superpower. Prey, meanwhile, faced a terrifying new reality. Being eaten was now possible in ways it had never been before. A world that once felt like a peaceful drift turned into a place where vigilance became essential and slowness carried consequences. As predators pushed forward, prey responded with inventions of their own. Some thickened their protective coverings, layering their bodies with mineral plates that turned them into underwater tanks. Others flattened themselves to blend into sediments, adopting shapes that left predators confused and visually betrayed. A few crafted spines and spikes, early versions of touch me and regret everything, that discouraged attackers through sheer unpleasantness. Speed became a coveted trait, especially for those species without armor. The faster a creature could dart away, the more likely it was to see another sunrise, assuming suns were something it paid attention to. This escalating contest reshaped nearly every corner of the marine ecosystem. Predators refined their techniques. Some learned to lunge with powerful bursts. Others mastered ambush, lying still until prey wandered too close. A few invented drilling or crushing strategies, figuring out that armor was only useful until somebody developed a way to break it. The prey, in turn, embraced unpredictability. Sudden zigzags, rapid burrowing, or freezing in place became tools in the survival toolkit. Even hiding under sediment, once just a casual resting choice, became a full-fledged tactic. With each adaptation, the stakes rose. Evolution discovered that when two sides continuously try to outsmart each other, complexity grows rapidly. The predators that succeeded reproduced and passed on traits leading to sharper claws, better targeting abilities, and more efficient digestive systems. The prey that escaped lived long enough to pass down better camouflage patterns, more sensitive sensory organs, or harder shells. Both sides contributed to a biological feedback loop where every improvement prompted a counter-improvement, a perpetual escalation that fueled the dizzying diversity of the Cambrian Explosion. This arms race also created entirely new ecological roles beyond the simple hunter and hunted. Scavengers found opportunities to feast on leftovers after a successful chase. Filter feeders specialized in gathering particles, kicked up by all the commotion, thriving on the chaos of interactions they never participated in. Opportunists lingered near predator hotspots, waiting for scraps or moments when injured prey became available. Even the detritivores, those who preferred the fine particles accumulating on the seafloor, benefited from the constant biological churn as life and death fed into one another. As these roles multiplied, ecosystems became intricately structured. Instead of a simple web where nutrients moved slowly through sparse interactions, the Cambrian oceans experienced a dense network of connections. A single predator's hunting success could ripple through multiple layers of species, influencing who survived, who reproduced, and how energy flowed across the community. The emergence of niches, distinct lifestyle slots, allowed species to specialize. Some became seafloor grazers, scraping surfaces for organic films. Others hovered in mid-water, intercepting drifting particles. Still others clung to rocks, filtering nutrients from passing currents. Each role created opportunities for others, forming a self-expanding tapestry of interactions. Perhaps the most captivating captivating aspect of this ecological explosion was how quickly it accelerated evolutionary creativity. The pressure to avoid becoming food pushed innovation at a pace unmatched in earlier eras. Prey species that once lived leisurely lives now needed better timing, sharper senses, more reliable movements. Predators that once relied on simple grazing had to become tacticians, learning when to strike and when to conserve energy. Every decision mattered. The ocean became a living laboratory where success and failure were tested daily, and the results left permanent marks on the evolving genome. This predator-prey dynamic reshaped not only physical traits, but behaviors. The first faint echoes of strategy appeared. Patterns of stalking, fleeing, hiding, or coordinating movements. Though rudimentary compared to modern animals, these behaviors marked the beginning of decision-making as a survival tool. Nature discovered that brains, even tiny ones, were advantageous in a world where reacting wisely mattered as much as reacting quickly. In the end, the Cambrian arms race was not just a conflict. It was a catalyst. It propelled life into forms and functions that never would have existed in a peaceful world. Predators sharpened the ocean's edge. Prey honed its resilience. Together, they transformed the seas into dynamic ecosystems overflowing with innovation. This chapter captures the moment when survival became a challenge answered not by accident, but by ingenuity. When evolution, unprompted and unrestrained, discovered the thrill of competitive creativity and never looked back. If the Cambrian seas could have hosted a red carpet event, the stars would not have been sleek or glamorous in any conventional sense. Instead, the guests of honor would have looked like someone handed evolution a sketchbook, gave it unlimited creative freedom, and then wandered off without supervising anything. What followed were creatures so peculiar, so wildly inventive, that even today they feel like concept art for a science fiction universe that somehow spilled into reality. Among these unforgettable pioneers were trilobites, the armored icons of early oceans, and hallucigenia, a creature so perplexing that scientists spent decades trying to figure out which end was the front and which way was up. These organisms did not merely inhabit the Cambrian seas, they defined them with style, attitude, and anatomical choices that suggested evolution was having the time of its life. Trilobites were the undeniable celebrities of this era, strutting across ancient seafloors with exoskeletons that seemed designed for both fashion and survival. Their bodies were divided into 3 distinct lobes, giving them a segmented shield-like appearance that looked both sturdy and oddly elegant. Imagine a creature that combined the practicality of armor plating with the flair of a well-tailored suit. These protective shells were not static. They allowed flexibility, enabling trilobites to move with surprising agility despite their tough exterior. Their undersides were equipped with rows of jointed legs, each one capable of coordinated motion that let them crawl, scuttle, and explore their environment with confidence. One of the most remarkable features of trilobites was their vision. They possessed some of the earliest complex eyes in the animal kingdom, composed of numerous mineral lenses capable of detecting motion and differentiating light in ways that gave them an edge in navigating their bustling world. Their eyes were made of calcite, a mineral, turning their visual system into something that was literally rock solid. This unusual adaptation meant their eyes fossilized exceptionally well, granting modern scientists a rare glimpse into ancient sensory systems. With these crystalline eyes and armored bodies, trilobites became symbolically linked with the Cambrian period, representing resilience, innovation, and a kind of quiet charisma that comes from knowing you are built like a tank. But for every creature that radiated practical elegance, there were others that looked like evolutionary inside jokes, or experiments that somehow escaped the drafting table. Enter hallucigenia, a creature so strange that the first reconstructions of it had the animal flipped upside down and backward. When paleontologists initially uncovered hallucigenia fossils, they interpreted the long, rigid spines along its back as legs and the soft, wiggly appendages as tentacles waving in the currents. It took years of re-examination and technological improvements before scientists realized they had the creature completely inverted. Correctly oriented, hallucigenia becomes one of the most delightfully bizarre animals to ever exist. It walked on soft, finger-like legs arranged in pairs along its underside, giving it a gait that likely resembled a delicate, tiptoeing shuffle. Above these legs rose stiff, needle-like spines arranged like a row of defensive stakes. These spines were its insurance policy, nature's equivalent of shouting, "Touch me and experience immediate regret." Its head, small and rounded, sported simple features that made it look oddly endearing despite its gothic accessory lineup. The whole body seemed stretched, as though someone pulled a worm like taffy, then decorated it with spikes and gave it more legs than it really needed. Hallucigenia embodied a fundamental truth of the Cambrian Explosion. Evolution was not afraid to explore every idea, even the ones that looked like doodles drawn during a particularly restless brainstorming session. Where trilobites represented structure, predictability, and engineering brilliance, hallucigenia showcased whimsy, experimentation, and the joy of biological unpredictability. It was as if the ancient oceans were hosting an evolutionary talent show, where one contestant demonstrated master craftsmanship and the next performed surreal performance art. But these were not the only celebrities of the era. The Cambrian seas teemed with creatures so distinctive that any modern biology textbook featuring them risks looking like a bestiary of imaginary beasts. There were bizarre worm-like organisms with grasping mouthparts. There were armored swimmers with overlapping plates that shimmered in shifting light. There were soft-bodied floaters with delicate frills that moved hypnotically through the water, capturing nutrients with quiet finesse. Each species brought something unique to the growing complexity of the environment. New shapes, new feeding strategies, new defense mechanisms. What unified these creatures, no matter how peculiar their designs, was their contribution to the diversity explosion. Trilobites became ecological powerhouses, participating in sediment turnover and shaping the seafloor through their movements. Hallucigenia and its spiny kin added structural weirdness that confused predators and researchers alike. Other species filled niches that had not existed before, expanding the range of lifestyles the planet could support. This burst of innovation did not happen through intention. Evolution did not design these creatures because it sought creativity. It simply experimented through variation and selection. But the outcomes felt almost artistic, each organism adding a new brushstroke to the sprawling mural of early animal life. The Cambrian oceans began to look less like a simple habitat and more like a gallery of evolutionary prototypes. By spotlighting these iconic creatures, we glimpse the sheer adventurousness of early life. Trilobites marched confidently through their world with a no-nonsense practicality. Hallucigenia danced through it, wearing spikes and charm. Countless other beings swam, crawled, or drifted in shapes that would never again appear in quite the same way. Together, they formed a vibrant cast that filled the Cambrian seas with personality and presence, proving that when evolution decides to get creative, it does so with flair, ambition, and a delightful lack of restraint. Long before sharks cruised the seas with cold confidence, or giant reptiles roamed ancient oceans, there was Anomalocaris, the Cambrians' premier nightmare generator. A creature that looked like someone combined a shrimp, a manta ray, and a sci-fi alien, then dialed the intensity up to 11. In a world still learning how to handle the concept of predator, Anomalocaris arrived as the first true apex threat, setting standards for oceanic dominance before most animals even knew what danger was. If earlier creatures were experimenting with speed, armor, and sensory upgrades, Anomalocaris was the creature that forced everyone to take those upgrades seriously. At roughly the length of a human arm, astonishingly large for its time, Anomalocaris moved through the Cambrian seas with a grace that contradicted its unsettling anatomy. Its body tapered into a flexible, rippling form, allowing it to swim with smooth undulations. It sported large, stalked eyes capable of detecting movement with clarity that surpassed most contemporary species, giving it the kind of visual advantage that would terrify anything within its line of sight. Its mouth was a circular arrangement of interlocking plates that closed like a segmented trapdoor, a feeding mechanism so unusual that scientists once mistakenly thought it belonged to a completely different animal. And extending from its face were two fearsome appendages, spined, jointed structures that curled inward to grip prey with an unsettling precision. Anomalocaris represented something the oceans had never encountered before. A hunter built not through accident, but through escalating evolutionary pressures. Its speed allowed it to overtake less agile swimmers. Its grasping limbs were weapons shaped by the need to capture prey that was beginning to develop armor and evasive tactics. Its advanced eyes meant it could choose targets deliberately rather than relying on random collisions. In a world where most creatures were just learning how to navigate, Anomalocaris was already running complex behavioral software. This predator's rise transformed the seascape. Until now, Many early creatures could survive by simply being inconspicuous or moderately quick, but Anomalocaris shattered that illusion of safety. Its presence forced prey animals to become more defensive, more alert, and more innovative in their escape strategies. The same evolutionary arms race that had begun with the emergence of predators intensified dramatically as Anomalocaris expanded its territory. Creatures that once relied on modest armor thickened their defenses, evolving shells and plates capable of withstanding greater force. Burrowing species dug deeper and more frequently, turning the seafloor into a maze of emergency hideouts. Even midwater swimmers found incentives to refine their propulsion, adding unpredictability to their movement patterns as a countermeasure against a predator with such sharp visual tracking abilities. The ecosystem did not merely react to Anomalocaris, it reorganized around it. Apex predators hold a unique position in any environment. They influence populations not only by direct consumption, but by shaping the behavior of every species that fears them. In the Cambrian, where ecological roles were still developing, Anomalocaris acted as a sculptor, pressing life toward greater complexity simply by existing. Species had to adapt or risk extinction, and many did just that, branching into new niches where Anomalocaris was less effective or less inclined to hunt. This pressure generated a feedback loop of innovation. More sophisticated prey strategies prompted predators to refine their hunting abilities, which then pushed prey to evolve yet again. But Anomalocaris was not the only apex hunter in these early oceans. The Cambrian period hosted several formidable predators, some sleek, some armored, some equipped with mouthparts so strange that they defy easy description. These apex species, while diverse in form, shared a common function. They regulated populations and introduced tension into environments that had previously lacked high levels of biological conflict. Their presence brought balance and structure, much like wolves in later terrestrial systems or orcas in modern marine ecosystems. By asserting dominance at the top of the food chain, they created stability through the very pressure they exerted. These predators also spurred the development of mid-tier hunters, organisms that occupied the space between top predators and grazing species. These mid-level organisms often had specialized feeding tools, such as grasping mouths or slicing appendages, allowing them to exploit niches that apex predators did not. The emergence of multiple predator tiers marked a turning point in Earth's ecological history. Instead of simple linear food chains, the oceans began to host complex webs of interactions where energy moved through ecosystems in diverse and branching ways. The physical adaptations that supported apex predators were equally fascinating. Hydrodynamic shaping became more refined, allowing sleek movements that reduced drag. Musculature became stronger and more coordinated, enabling powerful thrusts and agile directional changes. Some predators developed sensory structures capable of detecting subtle disturbances, granting them an almost anticipatory awareness of prey activity. These traits did not appear in isolation. They were built on countless tiny modifications accumulated across generations, each one nudging predators toward more effective forms. Anomalocaris and its contemporaries exemplify how predators can act as engines of evolutionary progress. They introduced a level of challenge that forced life to reach beyond passive existence. Prey species gained sophistication because they had to. Ecosystems diversified because pressure demanded adaptation. The Cambrian's apex predators turned early seas into proving grounds, where success required ingenuity, resilience, and rapid change. In this chapter of Earth's history, top predators were not just participants, they were catalysts. They pushed ecosystems into motion, drove innovation across species, and set the stage for the dizzying complexity that would follow. Anomalocaris may look bizarre to modern eyes, but in its time, it was a masterwork of early biological engineering, a creature that shaped the world through its hunger, its speed, and its relentless need to survive. By the time the Cambrian seas had filled with armored wanderers, quick-thinking swimmers, and apex predators who clearly did not believe in subtlety, something extraordinary began to happen beneath the surface. Life started to specialize. Where early oceans once supported a handful of generalized lifestyles, now they blossomed into ecosystems layered with complexity, each species threading itself into an ever-growing tapestry of interactions. Instead of a simple flowchart, this eats that, the end. The Cambrian world expanded into an elaborate network of overlapping roles, branching pathways, and surprising relationships. Life discovered it could multitask, and once it began, it never stopped. In these seas, niches multiplied like enthusiastic new guests at a party that had been empty for hours. The seafloor, once a monotonous carpet of biological residue, transformed into a bustling landscape with creatures exploring every tiny possibility it offered. Some species grazed across sediments, scraping up microbial films with specialized mouthparts that worked like tiny underwater brooms. Others stationed themselves at the entrances of burrows, filtering passing water for nutrients. A few mastered the art of sediment sifting, stirring the seafloor gently enough to release edible particles without drawing the attention of larger, hungrier neighbors. Above the bottom dwellers glided a completely different cast of organisms, those who hovered in mid-water, not anchored to soil or rock. These creatures embraced the art of suspension, feeding on drifting particles as they rode the currents. Some grew elaborate feathery appendages to strain food from the water. Others developed simple loops of motion, circling the same small region where currents conveniently delivered meals. Their existence created a vertical dimension to the ocean structure, dividing space into layers of opportunity. Another group took advantage of life in transit. These were the opportunists, species that followed the movements of larger creatures the way modern birds follow grazing mammals. They feasted on leftovers, on particles kicked up during a chase, or on scraps falling into the water column after a predator struck. They were not hunters, not quite scavengers, and not passive filter feeders either. They occupied a niche that only existed because so many other organisms were stirring, hunting, fleeing, and burrowing. This was one of the Cambrians' greatest achievements. Life created conditions that allowed even more life to flourish. Meanwhile, burrowers were reshaping the seafloor from below, carving tunnels, chambers, and twisting passageways that created entire hidden cities under the sediment. These underground architects did not simply hide, they cultivated their own environments. Their digging circulated oxygen deeper into the substrate, altering local chemistry and inviting microbes to colonize new spaces. Where the seafloor was once a static boundary, burrowing transformed it into a dynamic, breathable structure with distinct layers, each supporting its own subtle micro-ecosystem. Even creatures that never burrowed benefited from this engineering. They grazed along freshly stirred surfaces or followed the trails of displaced nutrients. This increasing complexity sparked a fundamental shift in how energy flowed through the oceans. No longer did materials simply move from sunlit waters into a single chain of consumers. Instead, nutrients cycled in loops, passed from floating organisms to grazers, from grazers to predators, from predators to scavengers, and eventually back into sediments, where decomposers reignited the cycle. Every species contributed to this churning system, whether knowingly or through simple existence. Even the tiniest motions had ripple effects, creating opportunities for organisms several links away in the food web. Feeding strategies diversified just as quickly as habitats. Some creatures became suction feeders, pulling soft-bodied prey into their mouths with swift inhales. Others evolved slicing tools, small, efficient structures that allowed them to cut food into manageable pieces. A few experimented with rhythmic motion to disturb sediments, flushing hidden prey from the seafloor. These methods were not just different, they reflected deepening ecological relationships. A predator adapted to slicing prey would not compete directly with one that preferred vacuum-like feeding. Both could thrive in the same region, using different strategies to access different components of the nutrient pool. As food webs became more intricate, competition intensified, but also stabilized. More niche options meant fewer direct confrontations, reducing the likelihood that any one species would dominate too aggressively. Ecosystems became resilient through diversity, able to adjust to shifts in population by rerouting energy along alternate pathways. If one species declined, another could step into its role, preventing collapses and maintaining balance. The Cambrian oceans, for all their chaos, evolved an elegant internal logic, life supporting life through countless small exchanges. This diversity also opened the door to intricate behavioral patterns. Some species learned to exploit the daily shifts in light, feeding, or hiding at certain times. Others developed seasonal rhythms tied to currents or nutrient blooms. A creature might graze at dawn to avoid predators most active midday, or it might follow the shadows of larger organisms to stay concealed. These were not conscious strategies, but expressions of evolutionary fine-tuning, behaviors shaped by countless interactions where survival favored those who acted at precisely the right moment. And through all of this expansion, life continued to surprise itself. A species specializing in scraping algae might pave the way for organisms that consumed leftover debris. Creatures building protective tubes inadvertently created hiding spots for smaller species. Even discarded shells contributed to new forms of habitat, forming miniature reefs long before coral ever existed. The Cambrian seas glittered with coincidence and consequence, each action influencing the broader environment. By the time this chapter of evolution unfolded fully, food webs stretched in all directions, vertical, horizontal, and diagonal, like a three-dimensional blueprint of biological relationships. The Cambrian did not just introduce more species, it introduced more roles. These roles overlapped, diverged, competed, merged, and fractured, weaving together a system so intricate that even the simplest interactions contributed to the grand design. In this era, the ocean stopped being a place where life merely survived. It became a place where life collaborated unintentionally, built structures unknowingly, and formed systems without planning. The ecosystems resembled tapestries, dense, colorful, and interconnected, each strand vital to the integrity of the whole. Life was no longer a quiet presence on Earth. It was a sprawling, multi-layered performance, improvising with endless creativity and transforming the planet into a living network of possibilities. Beneath all the visible drama of the Cambrian, beneath the armor, the eyes, the mobility upgrades, and the sudden explosion of ecological creativity, there was a quieter revolution happening in the hidden machinery of life. If the Cambrian seas looked like evolution on fast forward, it was because organisms were suddenly equipped with genetic toolkits capable of constructing new body types far more rapidly than anything the world had witnessed before. It was the biological equivalent of waking up one morning to find that your basic set of tools had mysteriously expanded into a full workshop, complete with advanced gear you never ordered, but immediately knew how to use. Developmental biology, running backstage, became the foundation for this surge of innovation. To understand how this happened, imagine early genetic systems as simple instruction manuals, short, functional, and just detailed enough to produce organisms that floated, absorbed nutrients, and divided. These manuals were effective but limiting. They allowed small adjustments, minor tweaks, and gradual modifications across generations. But somewhere before the Cambrian period, the instruction manuals grew chapters. New regulatory genes arose, giving organisms the ability to control when and where certain developmental processes occurred. These were not flashy genes. They did not form shells or create eyes on their own. Instead, they acted like coordinators, conductors guiding biological orchestras that were becoming increasingly complex. Among these innovations were early versions of the gene families responsible for organizing body plans. They created zones in which limbs could grow, determined the placement of segments, and established patterns that could be modified without destroying the entire organism. It was a remarkable trick. Evolution found a way to reuse the same genetic tools in different combinations, like a set of modular parts that could build vastly different structures depending on how they were arranged. This flexibility opened countless evolutionary doors. The same basic toolkit could support creatures with elongated bodies, flattened ones, armored shells, or branching appendages, depending on how the developmental switches were flipped. A crucial aspect of these new gene toolkits was their ability to control timing. The moment when a gene turned on or off became just as important as the instructions it contained. By shifting the developmental schedule, activating a process earlier, pausing it longer, or accelerating growth in a specific region, organisms could produce entirely new forms. A slight delay in forming a segment could elongate the body. A faster burst of growth in one region could create a novel structure. These timing adjustments allowed evolution to experiment without rewriting the entire genetic script every time. In this way, small genetic tweaks could create large anatomical differences, fueling the diversity seen in the Cambrian record. Another invisible breakthrough was the rise of genetic networks, interconnected sets of genes that work together to produce coordinated outcomes. Early organisms did not rely on isolated genes, each performing a single task. Instead, they developed clusters of interacting genes that communicated to refine complex structures. This interconnectedness meant that once one part of the system evolved new capabilities, the rest could adapt around it. Complex eyes, for example, required not just light-sensitive cells, but also nerve connections, protective tissues, and coordinated placement on the body. Genetic networks enabled these components to evolve cohesively, making complex structures achievable within a relatively short evolutionary time frame. These networks also introduced redundancy, a surprisingly powerful driver of innovation. When genes duplicated, an organism gained spare versions that were free to mutate without jeopardizing survival. One copy continued performing the original task, while the other experimented. Sometimes these experiments failed quietly. Other times they produced new developmental pathways that opened entirely new possibilities. Gene duplication was the evolutionary equivalent of having a backup copy of an important document, safe enough to preserve, flexible enough to modify. Many of the dramatic body plans of the Cambrian may have arisen from these duplicated genes learning brand new functions over generations. Importantly, developmental biology also influenced how traits were inherited. As organisms grew more complex, their embryos became structured stages where evolutionary changes could be tested. A subtle shift in embryonic development could alter the number of segments, the branching of appendages, or the shape of protective coverings. These embryonic experiments played out repeatedly across generations, and those that produced useful outcomes became established features. Evolution was no longer limited to changes visible in adult forms. It gained access to the earliest stages of life, where sweeping modifications were possible. The interplay of these genetic and developmental innovations created a feedback loop. As organisms gained more flexible toolkits, they produced more varied forms, which in turn placed new demands on developmental systems. Prey that evolved better defenses pushed predators to modify their body plans. Predators that refined their structures created pressures for prey to alter theirs. Every new ecological challenge intensified the evolutionary use of these genetic tools, encouraging more experimentation in the developmental blueprint. What made the Cambrian Explosion so unusual was not merely that new genes appeared, it was that life suddenly gained the ability to reorganize itself. These genetic toolkits allowed evolution to remix, rearrange, and repurpose traits with unprecedented speed. Where earlier life changed in increments, Cambrian life leapt. The oceans filled with creatures whose forms seemed wildly imaginative, yet all were built from the same foundational genetic principles. It was as though evolution had unlocked a creative mode, granting itself permission to explore every architectural possibility stored within the genome. Ultimately, the explosion of diversity during this era cannot be understood without acknowledging the invisible architects hiding in the genes. The Cambrian seas dazzled with visible innovations, but their true engine was molecular. Beneath shells, spikes, fins, plates, and frills were networks of developmental instructions that whispered possibilities into each generation. With every small genetic shift, life gained new ways to shape itself, new paths to explore, and new futures to imagine. In this chapter, we glimpse the secret workshop behind the Cambrians' artistic bravado, a workshop powered not by intention, but by the remarkable flexibility evolution discovered within the genome. Life did not just acquire new tools. It learned how to use them with creativity, precision, and an unstoppable appetite for novelty. After millions of years of evolutionary fireworks, after creatures sprouted armor, eyes, limbs, spikes, frills, and body plans that looked like fever dreams made of cartilage, the Cambrian world began to quiet. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow, deliberate calm of a planet easing itself out of a creative frenzy. The explosion ended not because evolution ran out of imagination, but because the environment, the ecosystems, and life itself had finally reached a point where unlimited experimentation was no longer the most efficient strategy. Nature, having spent an exuberant chapter of its history trying everything at once, began gently tapping the brakes. At the height of the Cambrian explosion, the oceans had been full of opportunity. New habitats opened as sediments shifted, chemical gradients sharpened, and biological innovations cascaded through ecosystems like dominoes falling in exuberant sequence. But as species diversified and ecosystems matured, those wide open spaces, those evolutionary blank pages, began to fill. Each new creature added another thread to the ecological tapestry, narrowing the number of unoccupied niches available. When niches are empty, evolution behaves like a storm of creativity. When niches are full, it behaves more like a caretaker, polishing what already exists, rather than inventing something wildly new. This ecological saturation played a major role in slowing the frenzy. Early in the Cambrian, a creature with even a slight advantage, a new feeding method, a sturdier plate, a better way to swim, could carve out a living with relative ease. By the later stages, however, the oceans had become crowded. Every habitat had competitors, every feeding strategy had contenders. Even the seafloor, once the quiet backdrop of evolutionary exploration, now bustled with grazers, burrowers, scavengers, and hunters. In such a teeming world, novelty alone was not enough. Success required specialization, resilience, and the ability to outperform neighbors who already had a head start. This shift from explosive innovation to incremental refinement is a natural phase in the life of any ecosystem. Early bursts of diversity create foundations. Later stability refines them. As predators and prey grew better matched, as arms races reached equilibrium, evolutionary pressure tilted away from massive experimentation and toward fine-tuned optimization. Instead of developing entirely new body plans, species honed the ones that worked, streamlining limbs, reinforcing shells, improving sensory organs, adjusting behaviors. The Cambrian world did not lose its capacity for change. It simply began to prefer subtlety over spectacle. Environmental stability also contributed to the slowdown. During the early Cambrian, Earth experienced a series of dynamic conditions, shifting sea levels, chemical fluctuations, and climatic variability. Each shift acted like a nudge, encouraging new adaptations and opening opportunities for species ready to seize them. But as geological and chemical systems stabilized, these nudges became less frequent. The ocean settled into patterns that persisted for longer stretches of time, giving species room to specialize deeply rather than perpetually reinvent themselves. Stable environments might seem dull from an evolutionary perspective, but they are essential for long-term ecosystem resilience. Another factor was the maturing of ecological feedback loops. In earlier ages, interactions between species were simple, but by the end of the Cambrian, these interactions had become multi-layered. Predators influenced prey, prey influenced predators, and entire communities influenced nutrient cycles, sediment mixing, and habitat structures. This interconnectedness created a kind of ecological inertia. When everything depends on everything else, wild swings in body plans or behavior can destabilize communities. Natural selection, ever pragmatic, favored organisms that fit smoothly into existing networks, rather than those that threaten to unravel them. It is also possible that developmental biology itself began to settle. While early genetic toolkits allowed enormous freedom, subsequent refinements may have locked certain body plans into stable patterns. Once organisms discovered efficient ways to build limbs, segments, shells, and sensory arrays, those designs became templates that future species modified rather than replaced. Innovation did not stop. It became more modular, more conservative, more focused on enhancing what already worked. Evolution traded its spray paint cans for a set of precision brushes. For all these reasons, the Cambrian explosion did not so much end as transform. the rate of major anatomical innovation decreased, but evolution continued with steady purpose. Many of the fundamental body plans established during the Cambrian persisted through the ages, eventually giving rise to the sprawling diversity we know today. The conclusion of the explosion was not a fading, but a settling, a transition from a world rushing to discover what was possible to a world exploring what was sustainable. Perhaps the most poetic aspect of this slowdown is the sense of maturity it conveys. In the early Cambrian, life behaved like an artist, throwing paint at a blank canvas, swirls and splatters everywhere, each stroke revealing new directions to explore. By the later Cambrian, the canvas was no longer blank. The shapes had depth. The colors had balance. The painter began refining the details, adding contrast, shading, structure. Creativity was still present. It had simply shifted from improvisation to refinement. Nature, in the end, tapped the brakes not to halt progress, but to guide it. The wild experimental phase had served its purpose. It had populated the oceans with a dizzying array of blueprints. Now it was time to decide which blueprints could endure. The Cambrian explosion remains one of the most extraordinary bursts of innovation in Earth's history, but its conclusion is just as important. From this settling, this cooling of creative frenzy, came the stable foundations upon which the rest of evolutionary history would rise. When we look at the modern world, at birds slicing through the sky, at insects navigating the air with miniature precision instruments, at mammals pacing across continents, at fish flicking through oceans as if water poses no resistance, it is easy to forget that the blueprint for all this diversity was drafted more than 500 million years ago. The Cambrian explosion was not merely a historical spectacle. It was the architectural summit where life sketched the fundamental designs that would echo through deep time. Nearly every major animal body plan that exists today can trace its ancestry back to this evolutionary festival of invention. The long-term legacy of the Cambrian is not buried in the past. It is alive in every limb, joint, muscle, and nerve that moves across the planet. To appreciate this legacy, imagine the Cambrian period as the moment the universe handed life a box of sculpting tools and said, "Do whatever you want, but choose wisely. Your decisions may last a while." And life, in a burst of enthusiasm, created an astonishing variety of forms. Some of these early experiments faded into extinction, leaving behind fossils that look like nature's abandoned prototypes, but others became enduring templates. If you follow the lineage of modern animals back through time, winding down the evolutionary staircase, you eventually arrive in the Cambrian world, where their foundational structures first took shape. Take segmentation, the division of a body into repeating units. This design appears today in creatures as different as centipedes, fish, and humans. Although these organisms vary wildly in appearance, they share deep structural principles rooted in early Cambrian ancestors who learned to organize their bodies with modular precision. Segmentation allowed for flexibility, specialization, and evolutionary tinkering. A segment could become a limb, a jaw, a fin, or a sensory platform. Over millions of years, this modularity allowed life to specialize pieces of itself without rewriting the entire organism, an elegant innovation that continues to shape animal diversity today. Another legacy lies in bilateral symmetry, the simple but powerful idea of having a left and right side that mirror each other. This body plan, which feels so intuitive to us now, was one of the Cambrian period's great breakthroughs. Before it emerged, organisms were often radially symmetrical or irregularly shaped, drifting or resting without clear direction. Bilateral symmetry introduced the concept of a front and back, which in turn encouraged movement, orientation, and coordinated sensory systems. The very notion of forward became meaningful, whether it is the streamlined form of a dolphin or the determined crawl of an ant. That fundamental sense of direction has Cambrian roots. The development of specialized tissues also traces back to this era. Muscles capable of targeted contraction, digestive systems with distinct regions, circulatory structures for transporting nutrients. All of these innovations were refined during the Cambrian and have persisted ever since. Even the networks of nerves that allow modern animals to sense, respond, and coordinate actions can be linked to ancestral systems that first appeared in this evolutionary dawn. No matter how sophisticated current organisms may seem, they still rely on core principles established during that ancient burst of creativity. Consider, too, the wide array of appendages in today's world: wings, fins, legs, claws, antennae. All of these are variations on themes set forth in early Cambrian designs. When those first creatures experimented with protrusions for crawling, swimming, grabbing, or filtering, they unintentionally drafted blueprints that would later evolve into the full parade of modern structures. Wings did not exist in the Cambrian, but the body plans that could one day produce wings did. Fins were not yet perfected, but the architecture for shaping them began taking form. Every modern limb carries a ghost of that early experimentation. This legacy also extends into ecological roles. Predator and prey relationships, once crude and newly formed in the Cambrian, became lasting frameworks that still govern ecosystems across Earth. The arms race that launched during those ancient seas, speed versus armor, stealth versus detection, has persisted for more than 500 million years, refined but recognizable. Whether watching a hawk chase a mouse or a seal pursue a fish, you are witnessing a descendant of the original Cambrian dynamic, one organism trying to eat another that desperately hopes not to be eaten. Perhaps the most profound legacy is the simple fact that complex ecosystems could exist at all. Before the Cambrian period, life was sparse, minimalistic, and lacking the structures needed for biological intricacy. Afterward, the world offered ecological webs woven with predators, scavengers, filter feeders, grazers, and decomposers, roles that would expand, diversify, and ultimately populate every corner of the planet. Woodlands, coral reefs, grasslands, and even urban environments owe their multi-layered interactions to the principles first established in those primeval oceans. From a distance, the Cambrian Explosion can seem like a chapter sealed long ago, a curious moment observed only through the lens of paleontology. But its influence is everywhere. It hums beneath the beating wings of birds, flows through the arteries of vertebrates, flickers in the sensory antennae of insects, and anchors the bodies of crustaceans in their articulated shells. Even humans, with our upright stance, dexterous hands, and spiraling neural networks, carry the imprint of ancient evolutionary experiments. Our bodies are mosaics built atop Cambrian foundations. The long-term legacy of the Cambrian is not simply that life diversified, but that life discovered how to diversify. It unlocked the rules of building complexity, the principles of assembling body plans, and the genetic flexibility needed to adapt those plans into endless variations. Everything that followed, dinosaurs, mammals, whales, beetles, primates, emerged from that initial toolkit. The explosion may have ended, but its reverberations never stopped. In every movement, every adaptation, every biological novelty that appears today, there is a faint echo of that ancient evolutionary fireworks show. The Cambrian Explosion did not just fill the seas with strange and wonderful creatures, it handed future life the instruction manual for boundless possibility. If you could stand on the shore of the Cambrian world, impossible waves lapping at rocks that have long since crumbled into dust, you might expect to feel disconnected from that ancient place. After all, nothing alive then looks remotely like the creatures we know today. The oceans teemed with beings that seemed more like sketches from a surrealist dream: spined dancers, armored crawlers, ribbon-bodied swimmers, alien-eyed hunters. And yet, in the quiet space between their movements, there is a truth that pulls modern life and ancient life together with unbreakable thread. Those strange, chaotic pioneers were the beginning of us, not just metaphorically, literally. Every complex organism alive today, from oak trees to jellyfish to humans trying their best to get through morning traffic, carries within itself the echoes of that 500 million-year-old plot twist. It is humbling to realize that your body, your joints, muscles, nerves, senses, and the curious spark you call consciousness rests on foundations laid by creatures who never knew they were shaping the future. Those early beings had no idea they were making history. They simply fought to survive in oceans that had suddenly become competitive, electric, alive with danger and opportunity. Their genetic experiments in building bodies, their half-successful attempts to sense the world, their bold steps toward mobility and interaction, these were the seeds of everything that came after. We often describe the Cambrian Explosion as a burst of creativity, but what it really created was possibility. When you look at modern ecosystems, rainforests threaded with insects and birds, coral reefs bustling with life, layered in colors and patterns, grasslands echoing with migrations, you are seeing the long-term consequences of organisms discovering how to innovate. The rules of biological invention were written early. Build from modular parts, test variations relentlessly, keep what works, discard what fails, and let every success open the door to further complexity. This process, which in the Cambrian unfolded like a cosmic improv session, became the basis for all future evolution. Without that era's willingness to try everything, to push anatomy and behavior and genetics into unexplored territory, the world today would be empty of the diversity we take for granted. Even humans, who tend to place themselves above the rest of nature, are walking accumulations of ancient decisions. Your bilateral symmetry? Cambrian. Your segmented spine? Cambrian. The nerves that carry your thoughts, the muscles that let you move, the senses that help you interpret reality, all of them have roots in creatures that lived before plants conquered land, before continents took their modern shapes, before anything had lungs or wings or teeth shaped for chewing. We are, in essence, highly polished descendants of ideas scribbled in Earth's earliest evolutionary notebook. But perhaps the most remarkable connection between the Cambrian and today is not anatomical. It is philosophical. The Cambrian Explosion reminds us that life thrives on exploration. It flourishes when the world changes, when the old constraints loosen, when the environment invites experimentation. In that era, life did not know what it was supposed to be. It did not follow a template. There was no standard body plan, no dominant species enforcing sameness, no ecological elder telling newcomers what shapes were acceptable. Everything was permitted. Everything was possible. And from that openness came the spark that ignited 500 million years of biological storytelling. Modern life, for all its technological achievements, still operates under these ancient principles. We invent, adapt, collide with challenges, respond to them, and move forward. Our medical advances mirror the Cambrian quest for better internal organization. Our engineering mimics the efficiency of limbs, joints, and sensory systems forged in prehistoric times. Even our creativity, our stories, our architectures, our innovations reflect the same impulse that once drove early organisms to experiment with new forms in murky seas. We too are creatures of possibility. Standing in the present moment, surrounded by the complexity of the world, it is easy to forget that life once hovered on the brink of stillness. Before the Cambrian, Earth drifted in quiet biological minimalism. Then suddenly something shifted, whether triggered by changing oxygen levels, genetic breakthroughs, climatic conditions, or some combination of cosmic coincidences. Life stepped into a new mode, one that valued diversity, competition, interaction, and novelty. That decision, made not by a conscious mind, but by the relentless logic of evolution, reshaped not just the oceans of its time, but every age that came afterward. This is the heart of the Cambrian's legacy. It transformed life from a whisper into a chorus. It turned a planet of modest organisms into a world overflowing with structure, behavior, and ecological ambition. It set the stage for forests, dinosaurs, mammals, civilizations, and the very speech you use to describe it. Every creature alive today, no matter how ordinary or extraordinary, carries the signature of that ancient bloom of creativity. So when you imagine the Cambrian Explosion, do not picture it as a distant curiosity sealed inside museum glass. Picture it as the opening chapter of a story you are still part of. Picture it as the moment Earth cleared its throat and decided to get interesting. 500 million years later, the echoes of that decision still vibrate in every heartbeat, wingbeat, and ocean current. We are, all of us, living reminders of a time when life suddenly went wild, and in doing so, changed the planet forever.